Hello, I'm Rocio Blanco. The disruptive technology I've chosen for today's presentation is vaccines. Here are the major points that we'll go over in this project. First, a summary about the first documented vaccine. Then, a brief look at the historic timeline and development of vaccines from the early days of its evolution and through more recent history. Next, we'll take a look at a few famous early adopters and their experiences with inoculations. After that, we'll take a look at how vaccines have disrupted societies where they have been implemented. And lastly, we'll hear about how vaccines have impacted our species. Although it is difficult to pinpoint when the practice began, some sources claim that inoculation existed as early as 200 BCE. Several accounts from the 1500s describe smallpox inoculation as practiced in China and India, and one is referred to in Volume 6 of Josephine Needham's Science and Civilization in China. Later on, in 1661, when Chinese Emperor Fu Lin died of smallpox, his third son became Emperor Kang. He had already survived a case of smallpox prior to ascending to the throne. Later, when he eventually supported inoculation, he wrote about it to his descendants. The method of inoculation having been brought to light during my reign, I had it used upon you, my sons and daughters, and my descendants, and you all passed through smallpox in the happiest possible manner. In the beginning, when I had it tested on 1 or 2 people, some old women taxed me with extravagance and spoke very strongly against inoculation. The courage which I summoned up to insist on its practice has saved the lives and health of millions of men. This is an extremely important thing of which I am very proud. Keep in mind, this was back in 1661. As previously noted, the earliest accounts of inoculation were in China and India. Later on, when the Chinese emperor had his children and descendants inoculated, the method used at that time involved grinding up smallpox scabs and blowing that matter into a patient's nostril. Additionally, inoculation may also have been practiced by scratching matter from a smallpox sore into the skin of the patient.
Smallpox inoculation had been practiced in the American colonies years before the Revolutionary War. The practice was called variolation. The way it worked was this. Liquid from a pustule on an infected person would be taken out and put in an incision between the thumb and forefinger of an uninfected person. That person would develop the symptoms for smallpox, and once the smallpox had run its course in a very mild way, that person would be protected for life.
Later in 1706, Cotton Mather, a Boston minister, noticed a scar from a smallpox variolation done in Africa on enslaved persons. He inquired further among other enslaved people and found that many had been variolated and thought themselves immune to the disease of smallpox. Later, Mather would read of variolation in English medical journals and promote the practice in Massachusetts. In 1718, variolation in Turkey was documented. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu had her son variolated in Constantinople by Dr. Charles Maitland. Her husband was the ambassador to Turkey, and when she heard about variolation upon her arrival in Turkey, she was anxious that her 6-year-old son Edward have the procedure. In 1717, she wrote to a friend, "I am going to tell you a thing that I am sure will make you wish yourself here. The smallpox, so fatal and so general amongst us, is here entirely harmless by the invention of ingrafting, which is the term they give it. There is a set of old women who make it their business to perform the operation every autumn. The old woman comes with a nut shell full of matter of the best sort of smallpox and asks what vein you please to have opened. She immediately rips open that you offer her with a large needle and puts into the vein as much venom as can lie upon the head of her needle. Every year, thousands undergo this operation. There is no example of anyone that has died in it, and you may believe I am well satisfied of the safety of the equipment. I am patriot enough to take pains to bring this useful invention into fashion in England, and I should not fail to write to some of our doctors very particularly about it, if any one of them that I thought had virtue enough to destroy such a considerable branch of their revenue for the good of mankind. Later, in 1721, smallpox raged through Boston in the form of an epidemic. It ended in 844 deaths, and during this epidemic, physician Zabdiel Boylston, at Cotton Mather's urging, variolated 248 people, thereby introducing this practice to the Americas. Of those variolated, only 6 died. The case fatality for variolation was about 3%, and the disease case fatality was 14%. About 900 people left town for fear of catching the disease. At Harvard, the chambermaid of Cotton Mather's son Samuel contracted smallpox. Samuel's brother Increase encouraged his father to have Samuel variolated by Boylston, and Samuel survived the procedure. Mather was widely criticized for his role in promoting variolation. Much later during that century, Edward Jenner tested the hypothesis that infection with cowpox could protect a person from smallpox infection. Cowpox is an uncommon illness in cattle, usually mild, that can be spread from a cow to humans via sores on the cow. During an infection, dairy workers may have pustules on their hands. Sufferers can spread the infection to other parts of their body. We know now that the cowpox virus belongs to the orthopox family of viruses. Orthopox viruses also include horsepox virus, monkeypox virus, and variola virus, which causes smallpox. In May 1796, Jenner inoculated 8-year-old James Phipps with matter from a cowpox sore on the hand of milkmaid Sarah Nelms. Phipps suffered a local reaction and felt poorly for several days, but made a full recovery. Later that year in July, Jenner inoculated Phipps with matter taken from a fresh human smallpox sore, as if he were variolating the boy in an attempt to challenge the protection from cowpox. Phipps remained healthy. Jenner next demonstrated that cowpox matter transferred in a human chain from one person to the next provided protection from smallpox. He was not precisely sure about the nature of the cowpox material he used because he suspected that cowpox actually came from horsepox. In other words, he speculated that cows became infected with the same agent that caused a similar disease in horses. Recent genetic analysis of old samples of smallpox vaccine have revealed that the samples were more closely related to horsepox virus than cowpox virus. Later on in 1800, Waterhouse brought vaccination to the States. Benjamin Waterhouse, a Harvard professor of medicine, performed the first U.S. vaccinations on his own children. He went on to put much effort into encouraging public vaccinations. He began by writing to then U.S. President John Adams, with whom he had roomed while studying medicine in England. Growing convinced that Adams was either too busy or disinterested in helping to spread the word about cowpox vaccinations preventing smallpox, Waterhouse then wrote to the current Vice President and soon-to-be President Thomas Jefferson, sending a work he titled A Prospect of Exterminating the Smallpox. In a later letter dated Christmas Day, 1800, Jefferson responded, "Sir, I received last night and have read with great satisfaction your pamphlet on the subject of the kinnipock, and pray you to accept my thanks for the communication of it. I had before attended to your publications on the subject in the newspapers, and took much interest in the result of the experiments you were making. Every friend of humanity must look with pleasure on this discovery, by which one evil more is withdrawn from the condition of man, and must contemplate the possibility that future improvements and discoveries may still more and more lessen the catalogue of evils. In this line of proceeding you deserve well of your country, and I pray you accept my portion of the tribute due to you, and assurances of high consideration and respect, with which I am, sir, your most obedient humble servant, Thomas Jefferson." Waterhouse, on a later letter from Jefferson, noted that he gave the original of the first letter to Edward Jenner as a gift, thinking that coming from the Chief Magistrate of the Americas, it would not be unpleasing to the originator of vaccination. In 1802, variolation was replaced by the term vaccination. Dr. Jean de Caro, a physician who indirectly helped to introduce vaccination to India, suggested that inoculation should be eliminated, saying it is inconsistent for a government to uncover vaccination and not forbid inoculation. This was among the first of many efforts to encourage vaccination over variolation for its improved success and safety. Also that year, vaccinations were endorsed in Massachusetts. It became the first U.S. state to encourage the use of vaccine against smallpox. Dr. Waterhouse, the first doctor in Boston to obtain vaccine material, convinced the city's Board of Health to sponsor a public test of vaccination. 19 volunteers were successfully vaccinated. Initially, he sought to retain a monopoly over smallpox vaccine in North America, refusing to provide vaccine material to other doctors without a fee or a portion of their profits. This monopoly led to efforts to obtain vaccine material from vaccination pustules on human patients, or via clothing carrying pus from vaccination pustules. In at least one such case, a pustule on the arm of a British sailor used to obtain such material was not, in fact, from vaccination, but from a full smallpox infection. 68 people died after material from that pustule was used to vaccinate patients in Marblehead, Massachusetts. Eventually, other doctors began receiving genuine vaccine material from sources in England. After his initial monopoly was broken, Waterhouse shared his supplies without complaint. The origin of the term vaccination came from the Latin for cow, vacca. Edward Jenner insisted that this is the origin of the term, and he credited his friend and fellow physician Richard Dunning for coining the term. In 1820, in the last decade of Jenner's life, the London Bills of Mortality documented 7,858 deaths from smallpox, down from 18,447 deaths in the last decade before vaccination. Then in 1862, the death of the idea of spontaneous generation occurred. In 1860, the French Academy of Sciences had issued a challenge to French scientists. They should try to shed light on the concept of spontaneous generation. This is the idea which still persisted in the 1860s, that life can arise from non-living materials such as mud or water. Louis Pasteur took on the challenge, using a precise series of experiments to show that flasks of broth and water did not spoil when he prevented the organisms from entering the flasks. The Academy awarded him the prize on December 1st, 1862, though other scientists continued to object Pasteur's findings and methods. The Academy elected Pasteur to its membership on December 8th. Continuing with our timeline of vaccines, we pick up in 1879, where Louis Pasteur produced the first laboratory-developed vaccine, the vaccine for chicken cholera. Pasteur attenuated or weakened the bacteria for use in the vaccine. He happened upon this method by accident. In his lab, he was studying fowl cholera by injecting chickens with the live bacteria and recording the fatal progression of the illness. He had instructed an assistant to inject the chickens with a fresh culture of the bacteria before a holiday. The assistant, however, forgot. When the assistant returned a month later, he carried out Pasteur's wishes. The chickens, while showing mild signs of the disease, survived. When they were healthy again, Pasteur injected them with fresh bacteria. The chickens did not become ill. Pasteur eventually reasoned the factor that made the bacteria less deadly was exposure to oxygen. Pasteur worked on his rabies vaccine all through the 1880s decade. Meanwhile, in 1882, unfortunately, the Anti-Vaccination League of America held its first meeting in New York. Among the assertions made by the speakers at the meeting was the erroneous idea that smallpox was spread not by contagion, but by filth. This became a popular, though incorrect, argument of anti-vaccinationists, as they were called then. In 1891, despite that, there were advances in vaccine production. English physician S. Monckton Copeman showed that by adding glycerin to lymph, it acts as a germicide. As glycerin came to be widely used, it reduced transmission of harmful microbes via the lymph. In 1897, German scientist Paul Ehrlich won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1908 for his work on immunity. He developed a standardized unit of measure for diphtheria antitoxin. Ehrlich's development resulted from his recognition that the amount of antitoxin in serum varied greatly among different samples. Physicians could not depend on the potency of any given container of antitoxin when treating a patient, because the containers had no common standard for potency. Ehrlich's immunity unit marked the first standardization of a biological product and paved the way for future work with Sarah.
It's a hard question to answer because you could pick any one of them and point out why it seems to be the best one. The one that I notice most as growing up in the practice of medicine is that measles itself was never a big problem, but the complications from measles were deadly. There was a disease, for example, that we called running ear, and children would have measles and they would get an otitis media and they would develop an infection in their ear. They would develop a chronic mastoiditis, and out of their ear would drip for years a foul-smelling gray-green pus, and it lasted until some of them were adults. I had a cousin who was so afflicted, she had that complication of measles until she died of cancer from the same reason when she was about 60.
Well, before vaccines, essentially 100% of the children became infected with all of these. Rubella, maybe 15% escaped into adulthood, but measles, mumps, and essentially rubella were ubiquitous. Now, when these vaccines came in, this vaccine came out, and of course we had been using them singly before, but now we had a simple means for vaccinating everybody with one dose. We were able then to, in the United States, to make a very efficient immunization program, and in a very short period of time, these diseases have essentially disappeared, except for reintroduction from the outside or an occasional person who escapes or has a failure of immunization. But these are no longer clinically important diseases. Now, in the world at large, where measles vaccine has been given, we used to have 8 million deaths per year worldwide against measles. And after the vaccine, which became routinely used, was introduced years ago, it reduced the annual deaths down to about 800,000. So there have been literally many millions of lives, and tremendous disability has been averted through use of measles, mumps, rubella, and MMR. Now, MMR is commonly used in the developed nations, not throughout the world, and measles is used individually. But gradually, the whole world will be vaccinated with MMR. The vaccinology of the future is really going to be based on the heritage of the past, starting with the great giants of the late 1800s and coming up to the present time. Essentially, all of the technologies are now perfected. We have live vaccines, we have killed vaccines, we can produce recombinant vaccines, and there isn't anything else. Now, where's the future going to go? I don't know. But we're left out here with a large number of diseases, some of which aren't responding very well to that technology, certainly like AIDS, tuberculosis, and so forth.
Now let's look at some famous early supporters and their experiences with inoculations. In 1736, Franklin lost his son to smallpox. 4-year-old Francis Folger Franklin died of smallpox on November 21st, 1736. Rumors began to circulate claiming that the boy had been inoculated. Franklin then published a denial and advocated inoculation. In 1736, I lost one of my sons, a fine boy of 4 years old, taken by the smallpox in the common way. I long regretted that I had not given it to him by inoculation, which I mention for the sake of parents who omit that operation on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example showing that the regret may be the same either way, and that therefore the safer should be chosen, he wrote. Several years later, in 1764, a smallpox outbreak in Boston led the General Court to flee across the river to Cambridge. John Adams wrote, quote, "In the winter of 1764, the smallpox prevailing in Boston, I went with my brother into town and was inoculated under the direction of Dr. Nathaniel Perkins and Dr. Joseph Warren. This distemper was very terrible even by inoculation at that time. My physicians dreaded it, and prepared me by a milk diet and a course of mercurial preparations till they reduced me very low before they performed the operation. They continued to feed me with milk and mercury through the whole course of it, and salivated me to such a degree that every tooth in my head became so loose that I believe I could have pulled them all with my thumb and forefinger. By such means they conquered the smallpox, which I had very lightly, but they rendered me incapable of speaking or eating in my old age. In short, they brought me into the same situation with my friend Washington, who attributed his misfortune to cracking of walnuts in his youth. A few years later, in 1768, Catherine the Great of Russia was inoculated by physician Thomas Dimsdale with relays of horses at the ready in case the inoculation should go awry, and Dimsdale needed to escape from Catherine's angry subjects. The operation was kept secret, and Catherine recovered successfully. Her inoculation later encouraged others to follow suit. In 1801, another Russian empress also encouraged vaccination. The Empress Dowager of Russia encouraged vaccination, going so far as to name an orphan first given the smallpox vaccine Vaccinoff, and providing the young girl with a pension for life. Now we come to answering the big question about how vaccines have disrupted societies where they have been implemented. Here's a couple of examples. In 1738, a smallpox epidemic struck Charleston, South Carolina. Of the 441 people who were variolated, almost 4% died, while 18% of people who were naturally infected died. The results encouraged advocates of variolation. Meanwhile, the same epidemic reportedly killed half of the Cherokee Indian population in the vicinity. In 1820, in the last decade of Jenner's life, the London Bills of Mortality documented 7,858 deaths from smallpox, and this was down from 18,447 deaths in the last decade before vaccination. So it really comes down to this. The outcome of vaccines has been a dramatic decline in death rates and in disease proliferation. So if you need more convincing on the impact of vaccines on the human species, here's Dr. Stanley Plotkin. He is an American physician and has been working in immunology and vaccinology in the U.S. for several decades.
There are only three entities that have had major public health impacts in history. One is clean water. The second is antibiotics, and the third is vaccines. And if in fact it is possible in the 21st century for parents to know with a high predictive value that their children will survive and become adults, it's because of those three things. And really our society is possible, is made possible by those developments. And I mean, one of the things that perhaps the most important thought that convinced me when I was 15 to pursue this path is that no physician can have as major an impact on life and death as one who develops vaccines. Other physicians, of course, are critical to the care of their patients, and those who develop new surgeries or antibiotics or new diagnostic procedures are critically important. But a vaccine literally impacts millions and billions of people.
So thanks so much for those of you who have stayed to the end. Here are my citations. Special thanks to thehistoryofvaccines.org, where I was able to do most of my research for this project. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.